A head teacher, a book publisher, a translator of theological works, a naval instructor, a barrister, and a scientist all pile into a secretary's office and hide as a visitor walks into the main office to ask its official occupant about the training regimen of sea cadets. Thus begins the work of the primary British naval code-breaking team of the First World War. The reasons for this rather British beginning to things were not purely down to eccentricity. Formalised code-breaking was a very new field in the 1910s because, strangely enough, new technology had actually made it easier to intercept enemy communications than it had ever been previously in history. But only if you were the British Empire. That bit probably needs some explanation. You see, back in the days before electronic communication, orders to warships, squadrons and fleets had been physically issued in person, in port, or by letter in the ship's home country, before the ship had set sail. Sometimes a number of sealed orders were issued to cover likely scenarios at sea, but since it was otherwise impossible to communicate with a ship overseas in any kind of reasonable time frame, that was usually as far as it went. Occasionally, something significant would occur, but then you'd need to write down new orders and send them out on another ship, or overland, and hope your messenger ship could find and run down the ship you were trying to get the message to. The massive time lag involved meant that messages were generally not that sensitive, and would often be sent out on multiple ships to increase the chances of someone making it to the target vessel in about the same year. All of this changed when the Fire Nation attacked. No, sorry. All of this changed with the advent of a telegraph cable. By laying a physical connection from the home country to numerous destinations, often passing through many other countries, you could get a message vastly closer to your ships in a matter of minutes. If the destination port for the signal was a colony of your own, you could even then relay the message via a ship that was in port there, which would have a much better idea of where to look for your target ship, and it would have a shorter distance to go, since you could require your own warships to check in periodically when they made port, so you had a rough idea of where they were at any given time. If you were really lucky, you might even be able to catch the ship in port and update its orders practically in real time. The advent of early radio transmitters helped still further. Whilst their range was not great, you could build transmitters at various ports around the world and then send a telegram to the nearest port. This port could then broadcast it over short-range radio and hope that their range was good enough for the target ship to pick up on the transmission. Or another friendly ship could pick up on the transmission and relay the message further out to sea. This also encouraged various naval commands to require their ships to check in periodically whilst at sea via radio. Whilst the power of radio transmitters gradually increased, use of the telegram was generally preferred as it had higher fidelity over long distances and could obviate problems with the curvature of the Earth, and it was more secure since you'd have to be physically connected to the cable to eavesdrop rather than in roughly the same hemisphere. Britain found itself uniquely placed in this global telegraph network, since, thanks to its geography, almost any oceanic cable that left Europe and headed out into the wider world would have to pass through the English Channel. And thanks to its technological and industrial lead in the 19th century, Britain also pioneered the deployment of these cables to connect the Empire's colonies to each other and back to the UK, which meant that in peacetime, a great many European cables simply ran across the Channel into London to connect with the huge British-laid network, thus avoiding the stupendous costs of laying tens of thousands of miles of telegraph cable using specialist or converted ships. These two factors combined meant that Britain had a hand firmly on the throat of almost all global communication to and from Europe, either because they owned the cables, or the cables ran right past them through seas that the Royal Navies absolutely controlled. Various wars came and went, but whilst Britain might occasionally listen in out of interest, communication itself was generally unimpeded, and towards the end of the 19th century a number of major European nations laid their own telegraph cable network as funding became available, albeit that, as mentioned, these cables still had to run through the English Channel. Then came the First World War, and suddenly, within days of the outbreak of the war, German officials woke up to find that the British had not only severed all 6 cables connecting Germany to the British telegraph network, they had also located, hauled up out of the ocean, and cut the 5 German-owned cables that ran down the channel, at a stroke cutting Germany off from almost entirely from the outside world. For rather obvious reasons, the Germans couldn't use any cables belonging to their immediate neighbours, France, Russia, and soon enough Italy, leaving them with a very few cables owned by neutral countries that they could use. But the distances involved in transoceanic communication meant that practically every such remaining cable in existence all came ashore in Cornwall, on the southwestern extremity of England, where a relay station would boost the signal's strength to ensure that they reached their destinations in an intelligible state. The British only too happily set up a secret monitoring team to listen in on anything that came through this massive communications hub. With access to neutral cables in any case limited, lest the neutral countries be held to be on the German side, the Germans were forced to turn to primarily radio communications, even using them to talk to their own fleet in harbour, since it meant that communication back to Berlin and other such command centres could be done via the same method, regardless of whether the ships were at sea or in port. Also, for simplicity, and also to ensure signal fidelity at long distances, German High Command demanded regular daily status and position updates from its ships, and German radio signals were helpfully blasted out at full power almost all of the time. This also encouraged many German ships to relatively freely chat over the radio during operations and even whilst in port, rather than using flags or signal lights. This contrasted sharply with British practice, where all signals to the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow, and later the battlecruiser fleet at Rosyth, were sent by a telegraph cable. Ships were then instructed to use the radio as little as possible, and even then with the signal strength turned down to the absolute minimum, using relay ships if needed to get a message to shore. Essentially, the radio spectrum of operations in the North Sea and further afield in 1914 onwards resembled something like this on one side.
I say, chaps, the maid has served the tea to the bishop. No jam on the scones. Pass it on.
Meanwhile, on the other side,
Ja, Hans, the weather is lovely this time of year. Sehr good, and I am 40 miles from home and heading directly southwest. Just like me, only I am heading out. Are you ready for operations next week? Yeah, good. Excellent. Goodbye.
rather unsurprisingly then, the British were almost being buried in paperwork detailing intercepted German messages. But of course, the Germans weren't stupid, so the messages largely consisted of strings of nonsensical letters and numbers, since the orders were broken down into a series of stock code blocks and were also enciphered, which meant that the message would need a cipher key to interpret, and then a code book to work out what the decoded message actually meant. The reason for the double layer of security was because, unlike in the Second World War, where there was no mechanical system in existence at this time that could come up with a hideously complex cipher key like Enigma, the ciphers had to be generated by human minds, and Germany was perfectly aware that that meant other human minds could, in theory, break them given enough time. But if all that deciphering got them was 23547, 67892, 61591, etc., then it still meant nothing. Still, until the ciphers were cracked, nobody knew what the Germans were sending, and so we end up in the situation described at the start of the video, where Rear Admiral Henry Oliver found himself appointed as Director of Intelligence, but nobody who worked for him had any real idea about code breaking. Luckily, he knew his friend, Sir Alfred Ewing, the Director of Naval Education, was also an engineering professor with a deep knowledge and interest in both radios and ciphers. Helpfully, the Germans had been considerate enough to engineer the war to start at the beginning of the summer holidays, and so with all the naval cadets sent off to war and the rest of the British school population at home for the next couple of months, Ewing was free to start work on decoding and also enlist a number of other academic colleagues who found themselves without students. Due to the top-secret nature of the work and the ad hoc speed of the group's construction, they spent the first few months of the war decoding German traffic in their spare time in Ewing's office, hence having to hide in the adjacent secretary's room every time somebody showed up to ask Ewing about something pertaining to his actual usual work. In addition to tapping the telegraph cables and using the one naval wireless intercepting array, they quickly turned a number of other government and private radio antenna arrays to the purpose, and were soon working with a slightly more formal army department on both naval messages and those from the Western Front. However, whilst the signal interception capacity grew quickly, without the codebooks, the streams of numbers and letters produced meant relatively little. And as September rolled around, most of the initial academic staff recruited to the role had to go back to their regular jobs. Things looked a little stuck in the mud, but then, as the autumn of 1914 wore on, a series of spectacular intelligence coups were scored. The Germans had a number of codebooks, largely because the sheer number of orders they had codified was so large that a single master codebook, aside from being a huge security risk, would also likely be as large as a small child, and thus rather unwieldy. A lot of it would also be pointless, since the codes for reporting on a warship's operational status were useless to merchantmen. Codes describing the status of a merchant's cargo were not much help to a naval attaché in a foreign country, and nor were high-level phrases designed for admirals much use to a ship's captain who simply wanted to tell somebody that he needed a bit more coal. And so there were a number of codebooks circulating around German naval operations. Even cut down, they were huge tomes. The Signalbuch der Kaiserlichen Marine, or SKM codebook, had just over 34,000 different instructions codified, and this was the smallest one. In each case, the instruction was represented by a three-letter group. This codebook was then used to report important data pertaining to the High Seas Fleet, such as the location of enemy shipping, the location of the High Seas Fleet's own warships, and orders to change course or meet with other ships. Individual ships were also identified in these transmissions by means of unique code blocks. In late August 1914, SMS Magdeburg, a light cruiser, was leading another light cruiser and some destroyers into the Gulf of Finland, but when a heavy fog descended, they became separated, and Magdeburg ran aground near Russian-controlled territory. It was quite stuck fast, and so a destroyer was brought alongside to take off the crew whilst the ship was rigged to blow. Whilst this was going on, the fog began to clear to reveal a pair of Russian cruisers, one armoured cruiser and one protected cruiser, to the equal surprise of all parties. The Russians closed in and opened fire, and before much beyond a partial detonation of the demolition charges could be achieved, the Russians had boarded and captured the German ship. According to official German accounts, the ship's 4 copies of this codebook were thrown overboard, but recovered before they could sink, since codebooks were designed to rapidly lose their ink and disintegrate if they were immersed in water. Whereas, according to the Russians, 3 out of the 4 copies were found left in the chart house of the ship. They kept 2 of them, but copy 151 was offered to the British, who sent a cruiser to collect it. Initially, the book was of relatively little help, since cracking the cipher part of the encoding was not going too well. However, as with Enigma's efforts decades later, the Germans helpfully had a lazy radio operator who had sent out a number of sequentially numbered messages, which then made cross-comparison much easier when the same batch of signals were retransmitted elsewhere in ciphered form. Once the basic form of the cipher was known, it proved relatively easy to keep up with the various changes that were periodically made, which were often not that different from previous ciphers. This was helped further still by the fact that all decoding aboard ships relied on manual work by signal officers, so when the cipher key was changed, confused officers would often send return messages asking for the original message to be resent under the old key, as well as under the new key, so that they could confirm they'd gotten the hang of the new cipher, which of course gave the British a perfect comparison of the same signal under the old and new ciphers, which accelerated the work breaking the new encoding dramatically. Initially, most of the decoded messages were to do with reports on the location of various Allied shipping, which was somewhat useful in a general sense, but not especially so. But then the listening array was switched to shortwave receiving, and suddenly the reports pouring in were all about the movement of the High Seas Fleet, which was a lot more interesting to the Admiralty. It was during this time that the Decryption group was moved from Ewing's office and to the old Admiralty building, and into the room which would give the group its eventual nickname, Room 40. Whilst the Germans had suspicions right from the day that Magdeburg was lost that the codebooks might not have been destroyed, with tens of thousands of entries in the book, even if you could convince everyone of the appropriate authority level that signals were at risk, it would take a long time to rewrite the entire book. Changing the cipher was thought to be good enough in the interim, but as we've seen, the British, with some unintentional assistance from the Germans, were happily on top of that particular issue. Eventually, the SKM codebook would be replaced in late 1916, but by that point, such a wealth of daily reports had been gathered by the Royal Navy that within a couple of months they'd reconstructed their own copy of the new Flottenfunkspruchbuch, or FFB codebook, simply by comparing old and new messages that related to similar issues that occurred at similar times. For example, weather reports where the state of weather in the area could be independently verified. Likewise, in mid to late 1914, another codebook was captured, the Handelsverkehrsbuch, or HVB codebook, which was mainly used to talk to German merchant ships and, in certain circumstances, with the High Seas Fleet specifically as a battle unit. This book was actually the first to be captured, being taken from the steamer Hobart, who wasn't actually aware that war had broken out since it was operating off Australia at the time. This one had a monstrous 450,000 code phrases, and in military use it was used instead of the SKB codebook for most communication with patrol boats and U-boats, as well as mundane harbour issues such as reporting, entering or exiting for patrol. In the HVB codebook's case, the ciphers were somewhat simpler, but changed frequently. However, this was heavily compromised by the fact that U-boat patrols usually lasted longer than the life cycle of a single cipher, and so a returning U-boat would have no idea what a signal that had been transmitted to it said, and thus, like their surface counterparts, would often end up asking for the same signal in the old cipher, thus handing the British the means of working out the new one by comparing the two. This book would also be replaced in 1916, this time by the Allgemeine Funkspruchbuch, or AFB codebook. But the Germans helpfully ran a long series of repeated test signals before even distributing it across their forces, priming the British in how it worked before the first operational signal had even been sent. Its inclusion aboard Zeppelins on bombing missions over the UK also made recovery of an intact copy a fairly swift affair once a Zeppelin had been shot down. Lastly, for naval operations, there was the Verkehrsbuch, or VB, codebook. This was used for overseas warships, such as Admiral von Spee's squadron, flag officers, and diplomatic staff. For some reason, a copy of this codebook was present on the destroyer S-119, when on the 17th of October it and 3 other German destroyers ran into 4 much more powerful British destroyers, led by the light cruiser HMS Undaunted. All the German ships were lost in the engagement, and initially nothing further was thought of it, as the commander of SMS S-119 had managed to ditch his codebooks in a lead-lined chest, which went straight to the bottom. Just over a month later, though, a British trawler in the area brought up a rather heavy catch. The lead-lined chest had done its job a little too well. It had taken the books to the bottom, but it had also sealed them against any water contamination, and so even before the trenches on the Western Front were fully complete, the British had all 3 of the major German naval codebooks, this last one at a mere 100,000 codes long. Although this system would also be changed, this time in 1917, once again the German habit of transmitting the same message in old and new code to help out the receiving officers during the transition period basically handed the British the new codes on a plate again. So it was that before 1914 was over, Room 40 was sitting on nearly 500,000 German code phrases, and had cracked most of the ciphers, and the Germans were helpfully clarifying the situation every time they changed ciphers. It bears repeating that these codebooks were the vital key, since due to the lack of mechanical encoding, any cipher and its decryption depended purely on the inventiveness of the minds on either side, which meant that almost any signal would eventually be decrypted. At best, therefore, the ciphers were adding a delay to the information bit falling into enemy hands. The codebooks then were the main safeguard against that information actually meaning anything. In 1915, these efforts were supplemented by a new technology, radio direction finding. Simply, this allowed you to work out the position of a transmission by means of trigonometry. You would intercept transmission at one station using a directionally sensitive antenna. That would give you a bearing where the signal was strongest that told you that the signal was being transmitted somewhere along that line. You would have at least one other station elsewhere do the same, and of course this bearing would be different. You could then overlay the different bearings, and where they crossed over on a map, that was where the transmitting unit was. Both sides tried this, with German efforts aimed more at helping their own ships work out their true positions, since the airwaves, as mentioned before, were rather lacking in detectable British radio signals. But ironically, it turned out that the British were able to fix German ships' positions more accurately than the Germans themselves were. This wasn't especially due to any technical advantage, but simply due to the fact that the wider apart the two receiving stations are, the more different the bearings are, and the smaller the crossover area. The UK mainland, not including any stations on smaller islands to the north of Scotland, gave up to 550 miles of baseline width, whereas for North Sea operations, Germany only had about 350 miles of baseline width, and for Atlantic operations about 450 miles, due to the geographic layout of the two countries. Germany, also being further away from both areas in most cases, made their own bearings closer to each other, thus impeding accuracy. The Germans were aware of British efforts in this regard, and vice versa, and thus this acted as a form of unintended cover for Room 40's efforts, since if a British ship either avoided or homed in on a German ship or fleet that had transmitted something, it was easy for the Germans to assume that it was this direction finding that had informed the British that something was in the area, when in fact it was normally Room 40 knowing exactly who was out there and what they were up to, then using direction finding simply to verify the Germans' position. Additionally, in 1915 came a final intelligence coup. British forces in Persia managed to snag the luggage of a German agent operating in the area, and thus obtained a copy of the German diplomatic codebook as well. This would be critically important in a couple of years' time. This isn't to say that everything was sunshine and happiness. Room 40 was hampered significantly in a number of ways. For a long period, the Admiralty insisted that all decoded messages be immediately passed to naval officers for analysis, rather than letting the codebreakers work on them, which of course meant that vital contextual information was either missed or had to be reinterpreted, since the naval officer, handed a decoded message, would not know, unless he asked, when it had been intercepted, what station it was from, if that station had sent similar messages before, etc., etc. Additionally, the sheer volume of data being produced led to an almost paranoid level of secrecy developing. Less than a dozen people in the entire British Empire outside of Room 40 were permitted to even know of its existence or of the level of intelligence they were developing. Things were locked down so tight that it actually took a chance encounter with Admiral Fisher for the officer in charge of taking the information and briefing the Admiralty on what was happening to actually be given proper access to the information he was supposed to be reporting on. Actually getting this information to the operational side of the Royal Navy was even more of a pain, with only Admiral Jellicoe, in charge of the Grand Fleet, being told everything that the Admiralty had deemed useful. Even those in charge of other major Royal Navy formations, such as Beatty in the Battlecruiser Squadron, Tyrwhitt in the Harwich destroyers, and Keyes in charge of the submarines, were only given limited information, and even Jellicoe was only getting what the Admiralty thought he should need, rather than the actual signal outputs, which he would have rather preferred. That said, the information that did get through tended to be incredibly detailed. Thanks to the German habit of transmitting course and position regularly, the Admiralty had a better idea of where the German minefields were than most German naval officers, simply by constantly charting where the German ships were when they transmitted, and then noting where they weren't as they entered and left port, with the big voids where German ships never went most likely being minefields. Likewise, even before specific operational signals were given to the High Seas Fleet, the Admiralty usually knew something was up thanks to noticing changes in operational patterns, with ships being recalled to major ports to make up large formations, and other replacements not being sent out. Notable successes in this use of information came with the battles of Dogger Bank and Jutland, where in both cases, thanks to signal intercepts, the Admiralty was able to order British ships to set sail for the targeted operational area before the German fleet themselves had managed to distribute their orders and start the operation that they themselves were executing. Thus, in the run-up to the Battle of Jutland, the first British battleships left Scapa Flow 2.5 hours before the first German capital ships left their own port, and this was when the Germans were actually deciding when to start the operation. However, Jutland would also expose a number of problems with the use of Room 40 data. In the first instance, the fact that the codebreakers weren't allowed to do their own analysis almost led to disaster, as one of the naval officers asked the codebreakers where callsign DK was transmitting from. He knew from the past few days' work that DK corresponded to Admiral Scheer's flagship. But that was all he asked for, and so the reply came back that DK was transmitting from Wilhelmshaven, which it was. The codebreakers knew that Scheer used a different call sign at sea as opposed to when he was in harbour, and were perfectly aware of where the High Seas Fleet was. But it wasn't under call sign DK. So, given a very limited out-of-context request to tell them where DK was, they gave the best answer they could, and the naval officer concluded, based on his limited understanding of the situation, that the High Seas Fleet was still in port, when in fact it was about 6 hours out to sea. Allowing both the codebreakers and the naval officers to work together would have avoided this situation, as the context of the question would have been far more clear, or the question may even have been unnecessary, as the officer would have observed the codebreakers tracking the High Seas Fleet for several hours already. Likewise, in the night action after the main battle, a number of out-of-context messages were passed to Jellicoe, and other, more important ones were withheld, again, largely due to the disconnect between the naval officers choosing what to send and the codebreakers who weren't allowed to input the context of what they'd intercepted. This led Jellicoe to distrust some of the intelligence reports, and of course, he wasn't receiving others. This is perhaps the biggest missed opportunity of the war, since reports that weren't transmitted to Jellicoe included Scheer's request for Zeppelin reconnaissance over the Horn's Reef, orders to assemble torpedo boats at the Horn's Reef, and multiple updates from Scheer as to his course heading towards the Horn's Reef. If those had been relayed, then Jellicoe would have been in no doubt as to exactly where Scheer was heading, and the next morning would almost undoubtedly have seen a strung-out and battered High Seas Fleet finding its path blocked by a rather angry Grand Fleet battle line. But with all that said, the single greatest coup scored by Room 40 in terms of war-changing outcomes was the so-called Zimmermann telegram. In 1917, Germany planned to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, which it had previously curtailed due to pressure from neutral nations, including the USA, in the aftermath of the sinking of the RMS Lusitania. And it wanted to avoid conflict with the US, which was an entirely possible outcome if they went through with their plans. Just in case the US did get involved, they identified the need to distract the Americans from sending troops to Europe, and so they came up with the brilliant idea to promise Mexico funding and assistance to retake parts of the USA which had previously belonged to Mexico or its Spanish predecessor state. If Mexico would declare war on the USA, in the event that the USA declared war on Germany. However, thanks to the British cutting all the German telegraph cables, they could not send this signal directly, and so it was sent first via a surviving line to Copenhagen in Denmark, and from there, ironically enough, to Washington, where it would then be sent down to Mexico. The thought of using the USA's own telegram network to transmit a signal calling for the invasion of the continental United States aside, this plan ran into one major flaw. The cables from Copenhagen didn't run to the USA directly. Like all other surviving cables, it went overland through the UK for signal boosting in Cornwall, and so Room 40 had a copy before the German ambassador in Mexico did. Thanks to the capture of the German diplomatic codebook a couple of years previously, they rapidly got to work decoding as to what exactly it said. The only problem now was that to release this cable would be to admit that they were spying on the American telegraph cable, and particularly on American diplomatic communications, something that in the event they would actually continue to do until the telegraph cable network fell into disuse. Further, to release it publicly would also confirm to Germany that their codes had been broken. Luckily, the cipher used in the transmission was an older one, so it was considered that revealing knowledge of the cipher key would not necessarily compromise operational security, since the Germans would likely go on happily thinking that their latest ciphers were still secure. That still left the problem of explaining how they'd gotten hold of the transmission in the first place, as they rather liked listening in on American diplomatic communications. Since the message had been transmitted in code, and for transmission from Washington to Mexico had used a commercial telegraph line, the British simply bribed a Mexican employee for a copy of the telegram down in Mexico, which could then be verified as accurate by the Americans checking on the copy that had been registered at their end of the commercial line. With the security of Room 40's operations assured and the ability of the Americans to verify the transmission's authenticity likewise locked in, it was simply a matter of passing it over to the US Embassy in London, lighting the blue touch paper, and retiring to watch the resulting explosion. At the end of February 1917, the US President released the text to the press, and within days, the American populace was facing newspapers carrying the following on their front pages. We intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavour, in spite of this, to keep the United States of America neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis. Make war together, make peace together, generous financial support and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The settlement in detail is left to you. You will inform the President of the above most secretly as soon as the outbreak of war with the United States of America is certain, and add the suggestion that he should, on his own initiative, invite Japan to immediate adherence and at the same time mediate between Japan and ourselves. Please call the President's attention to the fact that the ruthless employment of our submarine now offers the prospect of compelling England in a few months to make peace. Signed, Zimmermann. Initially, some called it a forgery, but helpfully, Zimmermann himself thought the best way to damp the situation down was to explain that Germany was only going to support Mexico's attack if America went to war, and if America didn't go to war with Germany, then there was nothing to worry about. In so doing, of course, he had to admit the transmission was in fact real, and it turned out that basically threatening a country to play nice or else worked relatively well when Germany was bossing around random small Eastern European states, but it was somewhat less effective on the American population, instead having rather the opposite effect. Germany then going ahead with the unrestricted submarine warfare campaign sealed the deal, and within just over a month, America had declared war on Germany. With this and other successes under their belt, Room 40 would be merged after the war with the Army's intelligence unit to form the Government Code and Cipher School, which would then move to Bletchley Park and conduct a similar campaign of signal interception and decryption in World War II, inventing the first electronic computer along the way. After that conflict, it was renamed again to GCHQ, or General Communications Headquarters, and continues in this guise to this day, no doubt still listening in on practically everything electronic that passes through, or near, anywhere that the British flag still flies. So, hello Room 40 descendants, I hope you don't mind this video revealing some of your early trade secrets. I'll be right back.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.